It's April 1st, April Fool's Day, but also the very first day of National Fair Housing Month. And I thought that today would be a great day to share with you 5 ways to avoid becoming a fair housing fool. One of the biggest mistakes that industry professionals make is being too helpful. That's right, in this industry we have something called steering, and it's against the law. For those of you who may not be familiar, steering happens blatantly when we try to put people that maybe look the same, believe in the same way, maybe telling families with children they're not allowed to live on the 2nd or 3rd floors because they're too noisy. That is blatant steering, and it's illegal. But it can also happen in an unintentional way by imposing your own personal belief systems or even personal preferences on that of your customers. It happens with small things like answering questions about what type of demographics live at your property, or perhaps telling someone this is the best apartment for you because it's closest to the playground where your kids can get out and play. The truth of the matter is that sometimes we're a little too helpful in our industry, and as great sales professionals, it's our job to listen rather than to talk. You want to avoid dictating what's best for your customers so that you can avoid steering. That will keep you from being a fair housing fool. Issue number 4 is placing stricter guidelines on assistance animals. This is one way that you can become a major fool when it comes to fair housing. Many of you are no-pet communities, or maybe you allow animals, but you have guidelines, which is understandable. You're responsible for protecting the asset and your other residents. So it's important that we do have guidelines to ensure that everyone is maintaining the property and that animals are well cared for, but also under control. However, what some people do is they make a mistake when it comes to differentiating between assistance animals and pets. And if we make it more difficult for persons who have assistance animals to bring those animals on the property, making stricter guidelines than we do for our pet policies, maybe requiring shot records that we wouldn't require for a pet. What's important to know is that you can have animal guidelines, but they must be consistent for all animals. So the third way to avoid becoming a fair housing fool is to review your policies, procedures, and even your property signage to make sure that there isn't any discriminatory terms or policies that may have an adverse effect on a protected class. What do I mean? Well, there's this thing called unintentional discrimination or disparate impact. And what happens is we create policies and procedures and we even put them on signs, and the intention behind it was not to discriminate against a protected class, but they inadvertently have an adverse effect on a protected class. Let me give you an example. A sign like "No kids on the grass" or "No kids playing in the parking lot." These are all examples of situations that might be discriminatory because you are taking a protected class and you are creating a situation where they aren't allowed to participate like everyone else. So let me give you a quick example or a way to kind of test your policies and procedures. Take out the word "children" from that sentence and put in some other protected class and see if the signage makes sense. So for instance, would you put up a sign that says "No Italians on the grass"? Oh Lord, I hope not. All you have to do is replace that word "children" with another protected class, and if it sounds discriminatory, scary, and like, oh my God, I would hate if anybody ever saw that sign, then you know that it's not right and that you shouldn't be printing it that way. So use a more generic term. Ideally, you don't want anyone on the grass because you want to protect your grass, you want it to look good and be lush. So your sign would say "No walking on grass" or "No loitering in parking lots." It's not about the kids, it's about the activity that's going on, and we don't want anyone to create a situation that might damage our property or might be disruptive to the community. So be careful when you're putting these policies, signs, and procedures in place to make sure that they're not going to have an adverse effect on a protected class. The second way to avoid becoming a fair housing fool, asking our customers for service. In 2019, according to the National Fair Housing Alliance, this was the #2 lawsuit that was filed against our industry professionals. That's right, sexual harassment is taking our industry by storm. And it might not be something that you're completely aware of. It can be anything from asking for sexual favors in exchange for rental discounts or free rent. It can be demanding that residents cooperate or send lewd photos in exchange for maintenance services. But it can be as small as inappropriate comments or unwanted sexual advances. And these are things that are happening in our industry today. Our employees are in our residents' homes. They're alone. It's one-on-one. It's important that we understand how to protect our employees, but also what they need to do to ensure that they can protect themselves. The #1 thing that creates a fair housing fool in our industry is failing to accommodate for a disability. Again, according to the National Fair Housing Alliance in 2019, this was the #1 issue when it comes to fair housing. In fact, over 51% of fair housing complaints are filed on the basis of disability. It is important that you and your team members are knowledgeable when it comes to accommodations and modifications, that you have a policy in place on how to handle those requests. Anything from installing grab bars to assigning a parking space for someone with a disability to, yes, even permitting someone to have an assistance animal when you wouldn't normally do so. All of these things are things that should be clearly defined in a policy and procedure manual that you have for your team members. There should be documents and forms to use for the verification process. It's important that your team is aware, informed, educated in this area, but also they know what resources are available to them and who they can go to if they have any questions. So the 5 ways to avoid becoming a fair housing fool on April Fool's Day is avoid being too helpful. Stop steering. #4, make sure you're not placing stricter guidelines on assistance animals than you do for residents who have pets. #3, review your policies, procedures, and signage to make sure that they don't have an adverse effect against a protected class. #2, be sure that you and your team members are educated when it comes to sexual harassment and how to handle those things in the workplace. And #1, ensure that your company has a policy and procedure in place with documents and verification guidelines for anyone who's asking for reasonable accommodation or modification. These are my 5 tips to avoid becoming a fair housing fool.